and I'm on, and that tells you right there. We're back out on the bass buggy, and today we're talking 5 tips to take your finesse fishing game to a whole new level. Stick around, you don't want to miss this one. Welcome back to Lowbrow Fishing, and today we're talking about finesse fishing. Whether you're fishing a jig, or a Texas rig, or some other slow, dragging presentation, there are 5 important tips that you need to know that are going to take your fishing game to a whole new level. And they're not really hard. They're not going to cost you any money. They're real simple to learn, and it just takes a little bit of practice. And for some of these, we're going to be heading out on the water, and I can give you some examples. So let's go ahead and get started with tip number 1. Now, you've heard me say time and time again on this channel that focus is key. You need to focus on what you're doing. Focus on fishing. Now, we're out there to have fun and we're out there to relax. This is true. However, when you're casting that line out and it's in the water, getting wet, you need to focus on what that bait is doing. You need to picture it in your head, and you need to see that jig or that Texas rig in your mind's eye as you're dragging it or hopping it across the bottom. You need to be aware of how everything feels, how that jig feels coming across the bottom, how that Texas rig feels as it's coming through the vegetation. So you need to have focus. You need to be watching your line and feeling for those bites. Otherwise, you'll be missing fish. As with everything else in fishing, you need to make sure you're focused. Have your focus out in the water on what your bait is doing. The second thing we need to focus on is having consistency. When you're working that bait, try to be as consistent as you possibly can. And that doesn't necessarily mean working it exactly the same way every single time, but where you're putting maximum effort in every single cast. You are trying your best to work that bait to the best of your ability each and every cast. Again, this goes back to focus. You are going to be more in tune with what you are doing. You're trying to be consistent with your casting and your bait placement. You're trying to be consistent with how you work that bait. Now again, you can change things up. You can adapt to the situation. I'm not saying you need to be a robot and using the same retrieve on every cast. That would actually hurt you, and you probably end up getting fewer bites. But what I am saying is, try to consistently work that bait to the best of your ability. I think you'll be surprised at the outcome. Tip number 3 is probably one of the most important ones, and that is learn your gear. Learn how it feels in your hand. Make it an extension of yourself. When you're fishing from the bank, that Texas rigged worm or that jig is your eyes and ears in the water. That is effectively your sonar when you're dragging it across the bottom. You need to be in tune. You need to have the gear that works best to make that happen. Whether it's a bait caster, whether it's a spinning combo, you need to figure out what type of gear works best for you. Sometimes I use a spinning combo for a Texas rig. Sometimes I use a bait caster. It depends on the situation. And as we go out on the water, I'll show you some very important aspects of why learning your gear is important, especially when it comes to whether to peg or not peg your bullet weight. I have my weight unpegged, and you can see I've got a little bead on there that slides up and down, gives me some extra clack. And that's another tip for fishing a Senko. You need to know if you're fishing a bullet weight on there or a worm weight, you need to know when to peg it and when to not peg it, because that's an important thing. And to me, it all boils down to bottom composition. If you are working with a bottom that is covered in muck, grime, vegetation, something for that weight to get buried in and lost in, or something for that worm to get buried in and lost in, then you want to run your weight unpegged. Why? Because that allows for some separation. That weight may get down in those weeds, but that worm will rest on top of it. So you won't have to worry about that weight bringing that worm down in the grass as much. Now, it can still happen, but it doesn't happen nearly as often. Now, tip number 4 is the one that everybody dreads, and that is be patient. Finesse fishing is a slow and arduous game sometimes. Sometimes it can be numbers game, but usually it's not. Now that doesn't mean that haven't been days when I've dragged a Texas rigged worm and haven't come up with 20, 30 or more fish. There are days like that. But for the most part, when you're using a finesse presentation, it's because those fish are lethargic and you need to slow things down. You need to put that bait right in front of their face and you need to convince them that they need to eat it. And sometimes that's easier said than done. So it takes patience. Sometimes it takes a lot of patience. And since we as anglers enjoy catching fish as fast as we can and as many as we can, that can be trying at times. But stick with it. The more you work with it, the more you figure things out, the more patience you have, and eventually you get to a point where everything clicks, and you'll find yourself catching those fish a lot faster and a lot easier. So just have patience. It takes a lot of work, it takes some dedication, and it takes time on the water, but it will come with practice. And perhaps the most important tip of all, tip number 5, and that's how to know when to put that finesse rig down and pick up something faster. Well, you have to look at your environment, you have to see what's going on, and you have to pretty much let the fish tell you. And if you give them a chance, they will. Let's go out on the water and I'll show you exactly what I mean. Okay, you can see that the water is slick, calm. There is no one out here, which is strange. The last few times I've been coming out here, there's not been anyone out here. We're going to go ahead and get started. I've got a Senko rigged up with a 1/4 ounce bullet weight. And then another thing is when to say, okay, you hear everybody talk about fishing a Senko, fishing it slow. The fish are not biting. We need to slow it down. We need to slow things down. Well, sometimes I find that it's the opposite that is true. Sometimes you have to know when to put that worm down and pick up something a little faster. Like this jerkbait. You have to know when to be able to do that. I mean, clearly I'm out here by myself. There is no pressure. It's warm, it's overcast. So we are going to try to work this jerkbait and see if maybe they'll bite something that moves a little bit faster. And that tells you a whole lot about what type of mood the fish are in. And this is a Smithwick Rattlin' Rogue. It's the ugliest jerkbait you've ever seen in your entire life. That thing is ugly. Wind it down to where you want. And I'm on. And that tells you right there. And that tells you right there. They want something faster today. That didn't take but a couple of casts. He's been caught before. He's been caught, spiny, spiny. You can see that. He's been caught several times before. We got let's see here. He's probably close to a pound, between 3/4 of a pound and a pound. He's a nice little fish, but that didn't take us long at all. So, that is tip number 5. Know when to put the Senko down and do things a little bit different. In this case, the fish want it faster today. I already fished through there. There you go, little buddy. Have a good day. Thanks for playing. I already fished through there with the Senko. Didn't get anything. Came back through there with a faster bait and almost immediately got a fish. So there you have it. 5 tips for taking your finesse fishing game to a whole new level. I think if you take these tips and apply them to your finesse fishing game, you'll find that you'll have a lot more success when you're out on the water. Thanks for watching Lowbrow Fishing. We'll catch you in the next one.